Hello, hello. Hi. Welcome to tonight's Rouse Visiting Lecture, generously supported by the Rouse Visiting Artist Fund. I am super delighted and fangirl geeked out to welcome Hannah Beachler and Jacqueline Stewart. Let's give them a round of applause. For those who don't know me, I am Tony Griffin. I'm a professor of practice in urban planning here at the Graduate School of Design, and I'm also the director of the Just City Lab. So this conversation about filmmaking and placemaking, and a new term I just learned, world building, has all the elements, both imaginary and real, that I think intersect with the work that we do here at the Graduate School of Design. World building, as I've come to learn, is the process of constructing the imaginary. It requires much of the same considerations as the production designer as we consider as architects, landscape architects, urban designers, and planners. These considerations might include what's the geography and the ecology of place? What is its culture, its political and/or development history? Who inhabits these places? What are their practices and traditions? How do they seek and find shelter, food, social interaction? Where do its citizens gather, convene, create community? What shapes the image of the city? What values or aspirations do we hold for its city dwellers? What utopian or dystopian terrain best enables the society's tale to be told? And what is the dominant cultural normative? Is it masculine or is it feminine? Is it blackness? Is it whiteness? Is it nationalist or is it nonconformist? We share same considerations in the work we do as designers. Now, in the US, city building from whole cloth is virtually non-existent, or at least limited to the ways in which we build new suburban or ex-urban developments. However, globally, rapid urbanization trends are constructing new geographies for work, dwelling, commerce, entertainment, and social services. For our design professions here at the Graduate School of Design, city building most often responds to existing context, politics or political leadership, financing and regulatory constraints, and socioeconomic patterns of city building. And our interventions are often constrained by these contexts. Sometimes we're successful through design at realizing the aspirations for the city and its citizens through design, while other times we simultaneously perpetuate inequalities in the city through our work. World building, on the other hand, is free from these constraints and can construct both the desired and the fantastic. World building constructs a city for the purpose of its inhabitants to play out specific scenarios of either conflict or celebration, solitude or community in their most idealized forms. Its intent can be daring and even confrontational, or it can be functional, practical, or accessible. Place setting, either through world building or representation of existing places and spaces, is an integral part of the storytelling process of filmmaking. It can be background or foreground, political or agnostic, compliant or complicit, real or imaginary, masculine or feminine, black or white. I am so excited to hear what Hannah and Jacqueline can offer through their creative process and examination of the role of film and the city and setting, and hope that we might learn from their methodologies as we city makers, through the lens of architecture, landscape, planning, and design, may take some of the imaginary into our built worlds. Let me introduce both Hannah and Jacqueline, and I'm going to read their bios, and you can give me the sign when you want me to cut off your accolades. Hannah Beachler is a prolific production designer with an affinity for evocative designs and visuals. She crafts unique emotional landscapes for every story. She recently began prepping for her next project with director and frequent collaborator Melina Matsoukas, the pilot for FX's Y, The Last Man, based on the comic book series. Beachler designed Marvel's Black Panther for director Ryan Coogler, which just became the 9th highest grossing film of all time. Like, all time. Like, all time. All time. Right. Her incredible work on film earned her a 2018 Saturn Award for Best Production Design. She previously collaborated with Coogler on Creed, the spinoff from Rocky series, starring Michael B. Jordan and Sylvester Stallone, and Fruitvale Station, the 2013 Sundance Film Festival breakout film, and winner of the Prix de L'Avenir. I knew I was going to mess that up. In the Uncertain Regard competition at the 2013 Cannes Film Festival. She also collaborated with director Barry Jenkins on the 2017 Best Picture Oscar-winning film Moonlight, a coming-of-age tale that transcends traditional genre boundaries. The film was named one of the top 25 movies of the 21st century by the New York Times. In 2016, Beachler designed Beyoncé's stunning visual concept album Lemonade and took home the 2017, there's some beehive in the house. We can get into that. Took home the 2017 Art Directors Guild Award for Excellence in Production Design for Awards or Special Events and earned her a 2016 Emmy nomination for Outstanding Production Design for a Variety Nonfiction Event or Award Special. Hannah is very acclaimed. Current collaborations include Academy Award nominated director Dee Rees, Grammy and Emmy nominated director Khalil Joseph, Grammy Award winning director Melina Matsoukas, Academy Award nominated cinematographer Rachel Morrison, prolific cinematographers Alberti and Said, legendary academic Academy Award winning costume designer Colleen Atwood. Based in New Orleans, she is represented in the United States by DDA, so a little plug for them. She will be in conversation for the first part of our evening with Jacqueline Stewart, who's a professor in the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. And tomorrow she's being inducted into the Academy of Arts and Sciences here at Harvard, so let's give her a hand for that too. Jacqueline's research and teaching explore African American film cultures from the origins of the medium to the present, as well as the archiving and preservation of moving images and orphan media histories, including non-theatrical, amateur, and activist film and video. She directs the Southside Home Movie Project and the Cinema 53 screening and discussion series. Jacqueline is also director of the Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry at the University of Chicago and co-curator of the LA Rebellion Preservation Project at the UCLA Film and Television Archive. She also serves as an appointee to the National Film Preservation Board. Jacqueline is the author of the book Migrating to the Movies, Cinema and Black Urban Modernity, which has achieved recognition from the Society of Cinema and Media Studies and the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. She is a member of the Academy of Arts and Science, being inducted tomorrow, as I said, and has been awarded fellowships from the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Frank Institute for the Humanities at the University of Chicago, the Shelby Colum Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, and the New York Public Library Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture Scholars and Residents Program. Before I invite these incredible women to join the stage, we have a short film from Hannah that's going to run for a few minutes, and then, ladies, the conversation and floor is all yours. Thank you, and welcome.
How's everyone doing? Beautiful work. Such beautiful work, Hannah.
Thank you very much.
And it's such a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. This is really awesome. I'm having a good time.
So Hannah has selected a range of images that are going to be running throughout our conversation, and we're going to try to keep up with them, but it's so much that we might fall behind or get a little bit ahead, so we hope you'll enjoy those while we have this conversation. Could I ask a super basic question?
Yes.
It would be great to know what a production designer does.
Yes.
And maybe you could talk about that through your experience on Moonlight, since this is the first range of images that we have. Yeah. What do you oversee Where do you enter into a production?
I come in pretty quickly. So I get a script, you know, it's usually in development at the time. So I'm a little before pre-production even, when we're on the ground at the production office. They'll give me a script and I'll read it and I'll decide, yes, you know, I'm going to do this, or no, I'm not going to do this. And if I decide, yeah, I want to do this, I'll meet with the director. And I usually put together a little presentation to show him sort of what my feelings are about the script. So my presentations are just about my feelings, or not about like the things or what's in it. It's how I feel about the script. So
what do you mean, how you feel?
I know, everything is about my feelings. It's all right here. It's all about me. Well, you know, for me to connect to a piece of work, to a story, right? Because I really do consider myself a story designer, less a production designer, but that's the title that we have. So, you know, when you go to see a movie, it's because you want to laugh or cry, or you do laugh or cry, or laugh through your tears, or you get angry, or you get a sense of inspiration. So you have all these feelings. Right, and everything that's going on in the screen is doing this to you. You know, I think one of the really big things is what people don't often recognize is the production design, which encompasses building the sets, designing the sets, paints, construction, set decoration, props. You know, I oversee, or my purview is in costume design, hair, makeup. So it's really all the texture that you see on the screen that's moving you towards one emotion or another in complement with the story. So that's sort of what I do. So I oversee a lot of people. On something like Moonlight, I wasn't overseeing anything. There was 5 people, including myself. So it was like a crew of 5 women, and, you know, we did everything. And, you know, so it was a little, in that sense of it being such a small budgeted film, you really just have to be resourceful, and things have to happen on the fly because you don't have a lot of time. You don't have a lot of prep time. You don't have a lot of time to shoot. So it's sort of finding locations. This is a very location based, and the production designer is also someone who will go with the location manager and find locations that, you know, I feel fit within the frame of what we're doing, and especially depending on how well I know the director. And then I'll go with the director and say, look at these things, and I think this is what we could do here, or this is how we could augment it here. This is what I think, you know, because I have to keep in mind camera, blocking, actors and how they like to act, and adding details of things that you won't even see on film. So all those things are in consideration too with when I do a build. And then I have to consider the crew, which is an odd thing to think to consider, because I need to, you know, not that I wouldn't, but I have to have more than one entrance, because you can't just have, you know, depending on the size of the film, a bunch of people coming in and out of one door. Some people will get angry very quickly, and then they'll look at me like, where's the production designer? And I'll be like, oh. So, you know, it's finding really sometimes hidden ways to have those other doors, or working that type of a thing into the design. So, yeah.
So it's just this incredible kind of like translator role, a connecting role that you play, because you're speaking to the larger vision of the film, and at the same time you have to manage all these logistics, like where people can come and go, or where the camera can even be placed within a particular scene.
I have to consider the weight of the crane, which is 5,000 pounds, and I know that now. and it's 6 feet wide. You know, I would say, you know, that came into play big time on Black Panther. We'll talk about that more later, but, you know, something like that, the weight of the equipment that we have to bring into sets. Can it be, is, you know, because a lot of times when you do a period piece, something like Miles, I want to go into old places, old homes. What you just saw was the boxing ring was in this very old cathedral that they were trying to, you know, turn into an event space. And, you know, as soon as you walk on it, you know that the joists are no good, right? And it has a sub-level. So it's like, you can't bring a crane in here, it'll go right through the floor. So then I have to get an engineer to come out and to say whether, you know, how much weight we can put on the floor, and then we have to have someone shore it up, you know, get the construction. So I'm doing all of those things as well.
Could you talk about, and this is a great image to think about this.
That's my office.
Yeah.
That's
your
my
research,
office. Yeah,
your
from
research
miles ahead.
That's just incredible for this
that
film.
That was one wall. There was like 10 of those.
I imagine you have to pull together, or in your practice, you pull together a wide range of images. You're pulling from, speaking of Creed, you have to think about that franchise and what the previous films looked like. If you're going to take up the life of Miles Davis,
Yeah.
There's a lot of complicated and interesting and sometimes conflicting information about him, his space.
Well, that's part of the design within Miles Ahead, was that by the time we get to him and he's 75 and he's past, you know, he's kind of still in his heroin addiction. We're not really sure where he is. But the point of Miles was that he can't really remember anything. Everything is sort of, his life was so big and he was so big that everything was just got squished together. So a lot of what you see is a bunch of stuff from different parts of his life all in one place, because he can't ever put it together. So when he's telling a story about the jazz club, he could mean Birdland, he could mean you know, a jazz club in Paris, he could mean anywhere. So we kind of like tried to put those things together and do like the village, I think it's the Village Vanguard. You know, we did the interior, the color of the Village Vanguard during the time he played there, but we did the exterior, the color of the Birdland. And when we see the story about him being arrested, it's because he can't remember which one it was. So it was really about his memory, and that's how we wanted to, and his inability to sort of go beyond himself, and that's what we wanted to do, and that's the space before we got there, and Miles we started ripping stuff apart.
There's an amazing scene in that film. If you haven't seen Miles Ahead, because I know people have seen Lemonade and want to talk about Wakanda, but it's a remarkable film. There's a moment when he's in an elevator, and then the elevator kind of, you know, a wall gives way, and he's in a club, as you say. So there are all these ways that you were playing with the set design to get at this sense of his
memory at that time. Yeah.
It seems like you must have a lot of fun shopping.
You know, everyone says that to you when you're like, you come up with like 5 carts and you're sweating and you like phone is ringing and everything is going off at the same time, and they're like, what job do you do? And you're just like, and they're like, that must be so much fun. And you're like, does it look like fun right now? Because I gotta get to the car. You know, I've got a meeting in 5 minutes. So I don't shop that much anymore, except for, you know, whatever the set decorator brings me to be like, is this, you know, here's what I'm presenting to you, or here's what you were looking for, asking for. But when I was a set decorator, because I tried to do every job, I did do a lot of shopping. And, you know, I tell you what that did was made me the fastest shopper, you know, that you will ever be around. And my son is like, I can't even believe it. I'll like run in, just grab stuff, and you know, and you kind of have a sense, you learn stores and things, so I already know what I want when I get in there. I don't have time to waste. But yeah, a lot of shopping.
Okay, I said shopping, but maybe we should call it curating.
Curating, that's what I do now. Yeah. That's what I do.
Because what you're doing, you're selecting a bunch of stuff with an eye toward what's going to work together in the right combination at that moment. And I guess I'm thinking about that, trying to keep up with your slide presentation here. To think about Lemonade.
Lemonade.
Yeah. Because, and I guess
the queen.
The term curation comes to mind in this, because this seems like a really complicated text. There are multiple directors. It's not a narrative so that it moves across these different, you know, sets.
I only got to hear one song.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I laughed about that just now, but it wasn't funny at the time. I was like, really? A lot of security there. So one song, and I think it was All Night was the one, which is this video here. Yeah. And yeah, that was
a lot of switching gears.
It was a lot of switching gears. You know, we knew it wanted to be a deconstruction of like a woman's feeling in a relationship that she's trying to hold on to or fix or heal, and then kind of do that healing within her own self as well and gain strength. I mean, because first you're mad, you know, and then you want to kill everybody, and then it's like, okay, can we work this out? You know, in the simplest of terms. In the simplest of terms. So we needed to break that down while bringing in this aspect of sort of Black empowerment for Black women, you know, which I think is a very different thing than just Black empowerment. I think female Black empowerment is a very different thing because of, you know, Black women are oftentimes not heard and overlooked in this time and country. Well, always, but in, you know, specifically, we're feeling it more now. So that was sort of what she wanted to get out there in a way, to where you feel very small, to where you feel very powerful, and then use the canvas of, you know, 18th, 19th century plantation life. So, and in that sense, I always say Lemonade was a bit Afrofuturist, in which we took a reality of the plantation in New Orleans, which was a place of oppression, and specifically for women, a place of rape, a place of great oppression, and turned it on its head by making it a place of empowerment. So you see all these women, you know, at the dinner table that was just there. You see, you know, them in the dining room. You see them inside, sort of. You see the matriarchs, you know, later in Lemonade, where you see the older women, and sort of mixing this idea of very traditional colonial construction with African textures, as far as like the fabrics and some of the things that we did. So we would take, you know, a lot of Victorian chairs and cover them in mud cloth and, you know, wax cloth and things of that nature to sort of mix the two in a sense. So that's sort of what we were trying to do with that. So it was really all about this deconstruction and really getting at that. So there was no one thing that I needed to do as a designer, because there was no real structure, you know. And a lot of what I do, it's very nuanced in the fact that I think in architecture, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, but very quickly, in architecture, you know, my father was an architect. My mother was an interior designer, so I'd been around it my whole life, and it was always very oriented in the build, in the material, and what wall is going up, and how it's going up, and the plans, and, you know, all the different plans. It was very much about that. I understand that, and that's what I do as well. However, I always speak of it in a frame of emotion, less the hammer and nail of it.
Yeah. Which makes perfect sense why you would be the one to do Lemonade, which is all about sort of exteriorizing this internal emotional landscape. Yeah, in so many different forms, and bringing questions of race and gender and class into that.
Absolutely, and class is a big one, and we filmed a lot. You know, we filmed many more things than what you actually ended up seeing, because she also wanted to delve into Katrina a little bit, that was, you know, it's still a little difficult because I went through Katrina, so that was a little bit hard to like, okay, we're gonna make a water line. Okay, crew, you know, the New Orleans people. So, because that was a big thing on Treme, and I'm kind of jumping off of me and going on to another show, but Treme, there was, you know, we're recreating Katrina, like right after Katrina, and that's hard on the city again, you know. But going back to Lemonade, yes, it was very much about the deconstruction. So I had to make it feel like every set was a deconstruction. So you see in the parking garage, you see, you know, in the plantation, you see bits and pieces here and there. You see the porch, you see the little girl running out the front, you see the paper stage, which was sort of inspired by the old Victorian toy paper stages for very wealthy children, would get these really intricate, like paper dolls when we were little, but they were houses and stages and things, and they were beautifully painted. So I had that stage hand painted. And again, it's reclaiming something, you know. No.
You just touched on something that also seems really important in your practice, which has to do with what's visible and what's not visible. And I know we're looking at Wakanda.
I know,
already,
I'm
but
sorry.
we'll come back to Wakanda.
That came a lot quicker than I think I even thought it was going to come. I'm like, these slides just last forever, and they're okay. Sorry.
But there's a really important part of your work that involves things that the audience never sees. I mean, you just mentioned there are things that get shot that don't end up in a finished product, but also, I mean, there are elements that you add to your sets that can motivate the actors to give them a sense of the space and how they can inhabit a character, just for the sake of doing it for them and not necessarily to be seen. Could you share some of those kinds of details?
Absolutely, I do that all the time. It's so important for performances and for them to believe they're in the world that you're in. You know, for some cases, since we're looking at Black Panther. We're looking at like, boom, it just got here. Since we're looking at Black Panther, you know, that was going back and forth about like, do we do VFX? Do we build? Do we do VFX? Do we build? And it was very important to Ryan and I that we built because we needed to create a tangible world. It wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to play unless it was tangible. And you could see the actors touching and interacting with it. So I would put like, you know, you have drawers and you have all kinds of things. So to build the world, it's like, you know, I don't want them to go in and then open things and nothing's there, because they're going to go through a discovery as well. And oftentimes I'll get feedback from the actors and they're like, that is so cool. And I'll do some things that I can't say, but there was a couple funny things where it's like, oh, that's there. Okay. You know, they're like, that really, like, I didn't know exactly my character. That really helped me connect me to my character. So little things like, you know, in Tessa's apartment in Creed, let's say, you know, she had a lot of like little knickknacks and stuff like that. And what I ended up doing with her assistant was calling and saying, send me some of her things. You know, so her personal things. So that was also on the set. So when she got there, because she has a tattoo that says yes on her wrist, and that's a big sort of thing for her that goes deeper than just the word. But so we had yes, you know, on she has these little things in her apartment that are there, and her little knickknacks were around too. So when she walked in the very first time before we were shooting to look at it, she was just blown away by that, and then creating that space. And really, and I actually worked with Tessa a lot on creating her space, but we added all of the you know, we sat and wrote out music, because she was supposed to be a musician, and put it in there. So if she opened it up, we had like, you know, mixed DVDs or CDs that she would have made. We got demo tapes from people that I knew, because I knew a lot of people that are musicians, so we could have them there. We had all of the equipment work. So the weekend before we shot, Ryan and Michael and Tessa and Ludwig, who's the music supervisor, spent the weekend in that apartment and just hanging out and chilling and playing music, and kind of like what she would be doing if she lived in Philly as a musician at that time, and vibing and getting to know her space. And they could do that. And Ryan was like, yeah, it just felt like she lived here forever. And that's really the goal for those types of little things. There's probably more examples, but I can't think of them all right now because I'm really nervous.
No, those are great examples. Okay, so Black Panther.
Black Panther.
I was in the grocery store the other day, and this woman was like, oh, I love your haircut. Did you get that after Wakanda? And I was like, no. But she didn't say Black Panther. I take my glasses off at that one.
It's like, I can't even.
She didn't say the name of the movie. She didn't say
She just said Wakanda.
She said Wakanda.
Okay,
Wakanda is invoked as this incredibly profound idea, for lots of people. I think you would agree, right?
Absolutely.
Did you have any idea that the role you would play in creating this sense of Wakanda, which was not a new, you know, fictional thing?
No, not at all.
But it has this life now that is astounding. And I wonder if you could just talk about if that's the kind of impact you wanted to have. Are you surprised by just the resonance that it has?
I was absolutely surprised. I was just, you know, honestly, when you my expectations are always really high, but for this one, because it was this huge movie and this is my first time, my whole bar was like, just please people go. Go to it, and then don't, you know, really kill me in the, you know, critique of it. So you don't really know. It's almost like one of those things where when you look back at your life and you're like, that was really brave, or that was really courageous of me that I just did that. At that time, you probably didn't feel brave or courageous at all, you know? And when I was doing this, I didn't know that at all. I was just doing what I do, and I was putting me in there, but I didn't really think like, this is gonna be more than what I have done on any other film. Yeah. You know, I didn't feel that necessarily. Really not until like after the movie came out. And I started like, you know, I'd get on Twitter and there would be videos of people dancing in lobbies and dressed up, and, you know, not just African, but anybody's heritage. They were dressing up in their ancestral clothing and celebrating who they are and where they came from. And I was, you know, it was just like you're crying every day, and I'm calling Ryan like, will you believe this? And he's like, I can't speak. And I'm like, I don't know. He's like, I don't even know, you know, like we all kind of were like, we got to hide, like this is, because you're like, this is crazy. Like we didn't expect anyone to react in this way, to just, because I mean, when we all went in there, me, Ryan, and Rachel, and for all intents and purposes, we should have never been there. or would have never been there had we not had people believe in us who actually could pull the trigger to have us there. So Kevin Feige, Victoria Alonso, Lou D'Esposito, they're the ones that got us there. And then, you know, we, in that sense, had something to prove, or at least I did. Yeah. And so I can't really speak for Rachel. Well, I can. Ryan I can't speak for, but Rachel and I mean, especially as females, especially as a black female, and the first black female to do a superhero movie and a movie of that range and that size, I had something to prove. So I went in like, all right, I might die at the end of this, but I just got to go at 1,000 for 14 months, you know, and we did. We were on 3 continents. You know, we had stages in Atlanta, and we were doing R&D in LA. We were shooting in Busan, shot second unit in, in South Africa, and second unit in London. Yeah, so it was, and you know, I had teams on all of those, you know, and I went to all those places once for the initial like scouting and all of that, but then the teams went over and then they did all of that. I did not go back. It was always just like, what time is it where you are? And it doesn't matter. Just tell me what's going on. And I kind of lost the question because I'm a talker.
No, so let's talk about
the group I talked to earlier today. I was just like all over the place. So sorry. I'm going to stay focused. I swear to God.
You're doing great. This is awesome. Let's talk about what you did. Okay, so let's talk about and since you're showing all of these really extraordinary.
Yeah, these are the illustrations of the, you know, Great Mound, of all the bigger sets that we had. All the built sets.
It's just a huge range of like topographies that you had to be created for this. So in the interest of thinking about some of the questions about urbanism and how you were thinking about sort of like cityscapes, urban architecture, urban space, transportation systems, those kinds of things. What were some of your guiding principles in the way that you and the whole kind of creative team was putting together what this, you know, center of Wakanda would look like?
You know, Ryan really was our guiding light through all of this. And him being from Oakland, the town and the city, he has a real sense of what, you know, I grew up on a farm, so I was not brought up in a city. And he had a real sense of that urban feeling of being in a city as a young person and as an adult, because he still lives there. And he really wanted it to feel dense. But what I brought to it was, you know, the golden city. So when you see the big cityscape, he wanted it to feel dense. He wanted it to feel like there's a lot of skyscrapers and high rises, and that the city is really packed. But then there's another feeling when you're on the ground. You know, what I brought to it was a lot, you know, I thought a lot about the continent and all the different countries, and did a ton of research. But one of the pieces of the research was all the different climates. How did those climates then affect, you know, and this will eventually come back to urbanism, no problem. And how those climates, how did the tribes and the different peoples in the different countries then deal with those climates in those, you know, environments? And a lot of Africa is about migrating, and not migrating because you're fleeing something, but migrating or fleeing like horror, but because of the rainy season and the dry season. Right? So you would go downstream during the rainy season, and then you would have your village there. And it also had to do with economics, you know, in that, okay, we can catch more fish during this time here because we're going to be flooded out up there. So the rebuilding, that's why I think pre-colonialism, you don't see a lot of record of villages, because they in large be wiped out. When colonialism started, they stopped this migration of, you know, we're doing this for economic reasons, we're doing this for our community, right? And that's when, okay, now you're trapped, we're building borders, because there were really borders before in sub-Saharan Africa. It wasn't really like, you know, there were different tribal areas, and when they started putting up borders, it was like oftentimes 2 warring tribes were in the same area, or 2 friendly tribes were now separated. So the whole economics of those countries then changed because of that. So that's what I was looking at, and that we need to have all these different climate areas, all these different areas that show that in Wakanda, since it wasn't colonized, that migration still happens. You know, that was really important. And then the epicenter of that migration is Golden City, where it is in essence like in Oakland or San Francisco and New York, where you have all the peoples from the tribes. Some of them, not all of them, are there. So we looked at it as a very metropolitan city in that sense, and that's why you get the mashup. Because you asked me about that, and I was like, we'll talk about the mashup, because, and again, that reflects back on African American culture. And as an African American, I innately brought some of my culture to this. It's like when I'm sitting next to you or I'm sitting next to any black woman or black person, we're from different places, but we're not. So, it's not necessarily just about the city or the diaspora. It's about the way that people tended to live before colonization, and that's what we wanted to do, but then add in the modernity of it, which is the way that it looks, and the transportation is so important to Ryan. He loves a train. I mean, I think there's a train in every one of his movies. Yeah. And because that was one of the first things he said. He was like, what does the train look like? And I was like, train? Okay, just give me a minute on the Hyperloop. I'm still trying to figure out what the land looks like, because I had to build the topography of the country before I could even start deciding where is Golden City in this, and why is Golden City in that place. It's because it's where the palace is. So the palace would be some place where you couldn't traverse to it. You couldn't cross a border to get to it, so we needed to surround it with mountains. That's why you have all the steps. That's why you have the tiered land, which was a really big part of the agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa that was wiped out during colonization, and largely now you only see tiered land like that for farming in Asian countries. But it was a huge part of African agriculture and farming. It's just not there anymore, and it's the best way actually too. That's designing and building a way to have your water feed your land without actually having all of the technology to do it. Right. So that's where it was born from. But now it's gone. So we needed to add that back. And so it was these things. That was an important part. So I had to think about Golden City 10,000 years ago. They were farming on tiered land. That's why the tiered land is still in there, because the Golden Tribe was the first people to settle in Golden City, and they were farmers. Then the next tribe that came was the Merchant Tribe, and I took a sort of the history of the meatpacking district and the Native Americans for the Merchant District, in that there were cooling systems underground in New York. And so that's the area. Yeah, that's the area. That's why you have the meatpacking district, and why they sold things only at night. You don't really see that on screen, but Merchant District over time evolved into a more residential nightlife place because it was always open at night. But the story goes sort of in the same direction as the meatpacking district. So they were there second. When they started to realize that they can sell their goods around to the other tribes that were now existing in this area, I completely made up. I'm telling a story that isn't true. I just realized, I'm going on like this is some real thing, and it is absolutely what I made up. But that's incredible that you really can fool yourself with the story. I just totally fooled myself. I am actually telling you some real factual continent of Africa stuff, and it is not. Yeah, that was weird for a second. I was like, whoa. Because I'm looking down here right? You read this. Clearly, he saw, he knows. The Merchant Tribe isn't a real thing. That's where my head goes all the time. But that's how deep we had to go. I had to understand why Steptown existed. So, after that city, I'm going to tell you a little bit more. I don't even care anymore. I'm just going to do it. So after that city, I'm going to tell you all this news nobody else knows. After the city started to be built and the Golden Tribe became sort of the royal family and no longer was farming, the tiered landing started to be built. That's where we have Steptown. That's why it's called Steps, right? And it's also called Steptown because it's where young artists come to get their experience. So they also take, so when you see Steptown, you will see like, you know, a lot of Afro-punk looking people, right, you know, and you have the lip plate, and you have sort of the Ndebele painting on one of the buildings. So there's some tradition. You have some Senegalese artwork. You have the braai cooking, and then you have like the hover bus going by, and then you kind of get a sense of the train. You know, these young artists are taking what their tribal traditions are, and they're just evolving it into a new art form, a new tradition. The other traditions are still there. That's not denied. That's not destroyed. It's still used. Unlike us, we stick it in the building and we call it like, well, you know, you pay $10 to go see the thing that we don't actually own, right? And yeah, I said that. I heard some groans over there like, look, I said it. I said what I said. Anyways, so yeah, so we wanted it to be still a part of the community. Right. And those spaces then become these open spaces. I know you asked me, I'm gonna let you go. You know what I mean? I don't even know. I'm like going out of control now.
No, not at all. Because you're giving us a sense of how layered
It's layered.
Your thinking and your research, and then the actual visual design has to be in order to give a sense. I think you're answering the question of why the idea of Wakanda resonates with people so strongly.
It is. It's about community and family.
Because it's not completely disconnected. Although you could call it a fantasy space, there's so much about it that's tied to actual historical, cultural, economic histories that you guys have been tracing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that, absolutely, that's what it is. It's about community. It's about family. It's about kids. It's about ritual, spirituality, the things that you don't see in normal futurescapes, if you will. It's always like overpopulated and too many buildings and they can't all fit. It's Elysium, and then all the rich people are in the sky and everybody else is like, you know what I mean? Like these horrible futures that we think like that will never bleed back into our reality. It's just entertainment and it's fun, but it actually does bleed back into our reality.
And where are black people in the future, right?
There aren't any. We have, I don't know how many aliens with elephant heads, but you find one black person in Star Wars. And I think there were 2 Asian ladies. It's like, but how many, camels with body part, you know what I mean? Like what? I'm looking at this like, he's a lobster. But you can't have more than one black person? Okay, come on now. You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm saying. So and it's not a hopeful future. It's like, well, what do you have to look forward to? And then how do people then look around their own worlds? Like, well, what's the point? So now it's time to put, something different on screen. You put Black excellence on screen. To put, in many different ways, to put tradition back in the fold, to have evolved something and not just plunked it down because it looked cool. You know what I'm saying? To take a tradition and say, okay, how did that serve them through time? And then what did it end up, what are we seeing of it now? We did a timeline for Wakanda that started in the Bronze Age and went to the present day. So this timeline covered off where we were, all the points that we hit, in the real Western world. So industrialism, all the stuff. And then I was like, okay, so now let's all sit down and figure out what Wakanda was doing. So when did they have the internet superhighway? What were we doing? We were still figuring out how to get the Pony Express, to California, and they had the internet. Yeah. We had to figure out why they hadn't been hacked yet, because they don't work on a binary system. They have a completely different computer system. We can't hack it. They can hack us because they can mimic a binary system, but we don't know yet what their system, I mean, I know, but you don't know. I know what the system is, Right,
we're gonna have Professor Griffin come on and join us.
I'm blah, blah, blah.
We're gonna keep talking. Oh, you're gonna use the step.
I don't even want to really come up anymore.
No, come up. I'm just a blabber. I'm a talker.
A part of the audience, and I think I'll just try to figure out how to jump into...
Yeah, no, you start talking.
Conversation. Well, I mean, could go in so many different directions, right? So one, I'm just completely fascinated by this constructed development history that you're walking us through that's related to economic and social trends that are going on, and the city responds around it, which we all have. And in the United States in particular, Black narratives are very much tied to land.
Yes.
Right? And so you've now constructed that whole narrative for this place, Wakanda, now that we, like, some people really believe, and some people are really kind of annoyed that people believe it, and you've mashed these things up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So there's part of, I have a two-part question, because I actually want to get Jacqueline's response to this, as you've looked through, you know, a catalog of Black film, which is about the way in which you've seen the city show up as a vehicle for telling those narratives, right? So in the US, you know, we get a lot of films and movies, and we're trying to tell those stories through a white space, right? And not through the ability of creating that. And you've been able to deconstruct that in Lemonade. It was a bit deconstructed in Childish Gambino's video as well. So I'd like you to kind of talk about how effective Black storytelling and Black film has been in using the American context to enable that story. And then I want to come back to Wakanda and ask you about, in constructing such a rich history, who are your collaborators in building that story? So you are a story designer. Do you have real historians, real architects, real landscape architects, because real ecologists, and real is not the right word, other disciplines, how do they inform the way in which you create these histories and then ultimately create the environments that you do?
Yeah, the figure of the city across African American cinema has always been prominent, and the city has been a problematic space. And I think, for the most part, a space in which people have attached great hopes, and those hopes have been dashed. So we can take this all the way back to the early race movies that were made for segregated audiences in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. People go to the city, that's where you become corrupt. That's where you know, women lose their everything. And this is where families fall apart. And then even if we trace that through Black independent cinema of the 60s, 70s. I'm thinking about the LA Rebellion group, for example, Haile Garima, Charles Burnett. I mean, the city is a space of tremendous difficulty and oppression. People are subject to the city, and the struggle is how to find some agency, how to navigate the space in a way that makes you feel as though you can be a whole person and keep Black community intact. And I think we see that through the Boys in the Hood films, right? Like the police state, economic exploitation. So I just loved the clip reel that you shared with us, and especially my favorite line in that film when she calls him a colonizer, you know, because I think that the historical processes of colonizing and decolonizing really help us to understand what you and your colleagues are doing. It has to do with, like, kind of decolonizing the cinematic imagination. And really centering Blackness in a way, even in Moonlight, which you could see is like a story of a kind of abjectness. But still, there's a way in which there's a different relationship between Black people in those urban spaces that suggests that there can still be intimacy, or they can still be some kind of human connection.
Which is
that
a whole other manipulation, because you kind of have to take the Miami out of Miami in order for the Black narrative to be told, and for us not to be distracted by the Miami that's already in our head, right? So there is even an interesting manipulation that you do there, which is a constructed space, taking a real space.
You see Little having to traverse this urban sort of concrete crumbling, you know, right in the beginning, you know, urban concrete jungle, you know, where in some suburbs from like the 70s and 80s where it was like everything should be concrete. You know, you go out to some suburbs and they've repurposed them into skate parks and these types of things. You go into urban areas and it's just crumbled, you know, and so he's running from these kids because of who he is, through this scape, past the trouble, the drug dealers, that are there to, you know, make money on the lives of others, and hides in what, a trap house, basically, and sees all of the destruction, and he looks and he sees the needle and the spoon and the garbage, and he's hiding, and then you have Juan come and take that board off, and this light comes through. I'm a big sound maker. Comes through, right? Yeah. And illuminates him. This is the person who's going to illuminate him within this construct of this urban, what some would call an urban sort of nightmare in a way, right?
And is the yellow we see through moonlight supposed to remind us of the illuminating of
Juan?
Of Juan?
Yeah,
okay.
There's definitely, specifically, yes. There's the yellow and the blue, which is, he's in the blue car. That is him. The water, it's that lightness. It's that sort of, when you think of the sky, it's when you look up and you think of like the universe or God or whatever it is think of when you look up at the thing that's so much bigger than you. Yeah. To Little, that's what he was. When that light came through, it could have been an angel. It could have been God to him. So we kept him in that area. Now, as Juan is bringing Little into his home the first time, the home is this soft pastel pink, because that was a Miami, like the teal and the pink, that's very Miami. That's very, without being birdcage, right? Yeah. But then you see it's getting painted over. And as Chiron comes to us in a place of being in the Poke and Beans and Liberty City projects, which is one of the, hardest projects, are now tearing them down, in the United States. I think they filmed over 75 episodes of First 48 there, if that gives you any idea of that. And that's exploitation as well. So I'll just say that. But so as he becomes Chiron, and, the second time you see her talking to him, he won't speak. His mother Paula is now full on and immersed in crack. Juan's house is white, because now that safety, that warmness of Miami has turned into this city. He's in the school that's built on a prison plan. Because that's what we do. We build schools off of the plans of prisons, and we just add classrooms. Right. So that's really how that goes.
Right. So I want to loop that back to collaboration a little bit. So one of my favorite images here was that you actually had a plan of the city of Wakanda with like districts, the center cities, like the university. It was fantastic, right? So I would love to unpack your process a little bit more in terms of, I know you immerse yourself in your own research and with the rest of the filmmaking team, but do you look outside of your sector and your discipline to build that body of research, particularly for such a richly developed place that does not exist? And I'm sure some people, I'm glad you reminded them that this was not.
I had to remind myself. I was like, what am I talking about?
People will go home for dinner and talk about
like this
new African
woman thought she was from Wakanda.
Right.
It was strange.
So tell us about who you collaborate with, how your collaboration process works.
Oh, we collaborate with a lot of people. So we brought in architects, futurist architects who, we brought in a couple of people who are working on designing Google City, right, that will maybe show up in the West Coast at some point, and talk to her about what that is. Like, what is that? This is a completely technological city. So we sat down and we talked with her, and she sort of told us about like how they plan to make it more of a communal place with shared yards. All transportation is underground. All the technology is behind walls. There's a shared currency. Once you cross into this city, they're basically building it so you would never have to leave. So everything you need is here, right? And she's telling me this, and I'm a bit stubborn. And couldn't tell, and outspoken a little bit. And she's telling me this, and I'm soaking it in because I want to understand what does someone like Google think the future should look like. And as she's talking to me, and I said, well, who lives here? Because what you're saying to me, I can't even afford. So who's living here? you know, all of a sudden I see the big circle in the sky and Matt Damon like, I'm coming, you know? And it's like... right? And she really, you know, kind of looked at me and Ryan and she was like, well, you know, you would need to be... Clearly, you'd have to have money to live there. Well, that's not useful to me. You know, so mute on that. You know, that's where my stubbornness comes in, because then I don't want your idea. I don't want to be inspired by something that's only for a few. Like, that's not what we're doing here. So you got, you know, thank you for the information, but that's not the information I'm looking for here. You know, but we did then talk to experts who were in anthropology, geology experts we brought in just to talk about vibranium, which is the fake metal that Cap's shield is made out of, because I had to be, you know, an expert in metallurgy at one point, because I had to figure out how do you mine vibranium without exploding Wakanda, or the earth for that matter. I had to figure out how do you, that much vibranium that's that elemental and, you know, get through the atmosphere with, again, not blowing up the earth. So we had to talk to a lot of biologists, nanotechnologists I talked to. So I brought in a bunch of people, a lot about the science and the math, because I was never good at that. But then a big part of it was my dad's voice right here, the architect, the perfectionist, saying, you need to know what the land looks like, Hannah, before you can build anything. Because he would always say that to me. Like, I'd be like, draw me a house. And he's like, I don't know what the land looks like. I can't draw you anything. So I don't know if that's a lazy thing. I'm going to have to talk to some architects here. Like, was he just, like, really messing with me on that one? He just didn't want to draw me a house. Or is that real? But I took it as real, so whether it was or wasn't. And so I realized I needed to understand the land. So we brought in specialists about that as well, like the different climates in Africa was one that we saw a lot.
But even your description of the development history that you had to construct, and then the representation of that, and I'm so excited to go back and actually watch the movie now, hearing you, because what I want to look for is how I see the evolution of the city through different scenes, right? So you go into any urban environment and you can tell the history of the city by what is no longer there, what remnants are there, what's new, and then you begin to overlay the socioeconomic sort of story and histories, and sometimes those histories are erased. So I'm kind of now curious to go back and look at these landscapes you've created and see if I can trace the story you told us.
Because it's there.
Through what we see, because some of it looks a bit even though the environments are different. I can't really tell class. I read an interesting article where someone critiqued the film for not showing poverty. And then the writer went on to say, well, why would you want to see poverty? Wakanda, it's Wakanda. But there was a debate about, you know, what is society like and how does the built environment represent those forms of society? So I'm really kind of curious to look back through that. And you and I on our phone call the other day talked a little bit about, I have a handful of African friends who are architects, and when Wakanda first came out, you know, it was like, I was like, it was so great. Aren't you excited? They're like, and not because they didn't like it, but it's the mashup. Yeah. They were very conflicted by the way in which all these different cultures of Africa, the continent that is represented by many countries, which are really distinct, seemed to be seamlessly kind of mished and mashed and sort of around, and they were really challenged by that. And my interpretation of that was that because most of the world is, quite frankly, really not very well informed about the continent, the culture, what's progressive, what's metropolitan, what's rural, just its history overall, that Wakanda was creating this false narrative, and now people are going to go off in the world and think Africa is like this and still not understand the texture of it. Right. And I sort of said, well, let's put that on the table and have you educate folks about it. And I think you've done that even through this constructed narrative. So where I'd like to maybe take the conversation in my last few minutes before we hand it over is, there is a conviction you have to have as the designer, the person visioning this, to withstand this critique, to withstand it as a woman who is leading that vision, a Black woman who is leading that vision, and all of these forces that come at you, not just on this film, but probably every film and in every aspect of your life. We were talking about the fact that there are 105,000 architects in this country and only 440 are Black women. And I'm sure the same exists in you all's fields. So tell our students a little bit about what it took of you to hold true to your vision for Wakanda and all the other films that you've created.
I mean,
where do you show up in defending vision?
That's a thing for me. You know, I stand by what I do. And that's why I always say to people, or like when I'm working on my crew, it's like, I'll fall on my sword. I'll fall on my sword for you. I'm not falling on anybody else's sword, you know. So if somebody brings me like, okay, I think this, you know, this piece would work really well here, and and I'm like, yes, I see it, blah 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 blah, and we go and we do what we need to do. I stand by that, and that's all I can do. You know, if I'm a failure if I don't learn from criticism. I'm not a failure because something didn't work. I'm a failure because I didn't learn from it. You know. So I tend to want to take a lesson from what people are saying to me about things. Now, you know, when it gets like crazy and weird, it's like I'm mute. But when it's constructive criticism, you know, that's important to hear as well. And there were many reasons why, you know, I thought that one I hadn't heard. That was an interesting about the mashup, and it was confusing. And, you know, part of my thought about that, you know, my response to that would be, if the concern is that, you know, no, we don't know enough about the continent, or a lot of people don't know enough about the continent to really say, and then they might see this and be like, oh yeah, they got like, you know, whatever. And well, honestly, I'd rather them misconstrue it this way than what I grew up with for 48 years, personally. I would rather have a child sit in a classroom and have someone be like, well, in Wakanda, it's awesome, instead of them mispronouncing the country of Niger because I'm the only Black person in the room at 7. Because that was painful. So now, you know what I mean? And I think that's a big difference between African and African American. And I don't really see myself being either one. I always place myself in the hyphen, you know, and that's where I am right now. So this view is my view as a little Black girl in a predominantly white community growing up in the country, in Ohio, and how I felt when people said things to me about Africa, about, you know, all the hurtful, derogatory things that you hear as a kid, like, well, Africans are, you know, civilized. Well, I mean, our president called it a shithole, basically, you know. So that's not a shithole, you know. Let's just be clear. I don't know if I can cuss here.
Yes.
You know, I'm always really weird about that. I cuss a lot, but I was like, I'm trying to keep it. But you know what I mean? So that's sort of my response, is that if this is creating some kind of new narrative, then because this was created from love, from hope, from joy, from what our future can be, from putting something positive, from Black excellence, I would rather someone try to say like something about that. With that said, you know, that's just sort of like, okay, well, I can't get mad at that, right? I detect no lies, but I feel like I understand what they're saying, because it was a concern for me as well. Yeah, it really was. So let me tie one more thread before we hand it over, which is, you said this, you know, this is my vision as a little Black girl. This is how I want people to see it. So we are each little Black girls from segregated cities in the Midwest. So maybe I can end my curiosity by asking each of you to talk about, Hannah, maybe for you, you know, how, you know, the female perspective or the feminine city shows up in your work. How does the feminine story show up? You know, you've been looking at a breadth of Black films. Where is the feminine story? How are you seeing it show up?
in your work, and then at dinner I can tell you how it shows up in mine. But this is about you all.
My work. So, well, a couple things are coming to mind. You know, one of the things that we talked about a lot when we were looking at Lemonade, we being Black feminist media scholars, were the resonances between it and Julie Dash's work, especially her film Daughters of the Dust, which is not set in an urban environment, but is about the prospect of going to the city and what you try to hold on to before going. And so there are some really interesting ways, I think, that across your work especially, I can see a lot of resonances with the kinds of questions that Black feminism has been trying to address for a long time, about making space, about creating a sense of community, right? About honoring the intimate and recognizing how the personal impacts our ability to do political work and those kinds of things. So I just see you firmly in that line of people that we normally have focused on directors, and we haven't looked at the, you know, maybe small number of women of color, but incredibly powerful, creative, important women who have been doing work that sustains the same kind of idea over time. And then one thing you mentioned when you read my bio, before I could cut you off, was a project that I direct collecting home movies shot by people on the South Side of Chicago, mostly by like dads and uncles, but the films that we have that are shot by women, again, are doing exactly what you do. Like, these are the people who are paying attention to the food and paying attention to like the child's play and paying attention to like home decor in different ways.
The settings that enable life to take place versus just the setting.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's exactly that, you know, and I was very lucky on something like Panther. I think for most of my projects, and specifically working with Ryan, who I always considered a feminist himself, you know, he has a sense of intimacy, which and sense of place within an interior. You know, like a sense of sort of what you were saying, the detail to the children, to the family, to that's always very important to him, as is the transportation in the city itself. So in that sense, yes, you know, I see there being a sense of you know, Black feminism, you know, in that sense. I feel like a lot of what I do also comes because, you know, I would say as a Black woman, I talked about this a little earlier today, that when I work, I always have to be in this position. You know, I've got to be forward, I have to be up, I have to be shouldering everything at all times. You know, as a Black woman in this industry, you can't ever do this, because the minute you do that, you know, then you're seen as weak, vulnerable, not maybe useful, or
you recede. You become invisible.
And you exactly, and in the weakness, then you're able to be controlled. I'm a Leo, so that's just not a thing, right? But you do find yourself getting weak of constantly, it's exhausting, you know. So in that sense, I think that's in my work, this sense of constant female strength, especially with Black women. Yeah. You know, with Lemonade, of course I was with, you know, the Queen, so. And, excuse me, I was with the Queen. And again, I worked with her in Jamaica just recently for all her, all the interludes in OTR2. And it was the same, but it was a little more nurturing in that sense. And it was a little more sexy as well. And I'll go there and I'll say that because, I mean, all our stuff is sexy, but in a way it was more, because we did a lot of stuff with dance hall, and it was like, you know, Black women being able to own that femininity of being sexy and not being like, you know, childbearing or overwrought, like the things that were the tropes that we're presented with, but soft and feminine, because you don't really get that, you know. I say that to people all the time, like sometimes I just want to be vulnerable, sometimes I just want to be, you know, I don't want to be the one that has to like take care of everything constantly. And I try to create that in the spaces where there's a strong sense of women, like in the throne room in Black Panther. You know, it was like, okay, we talked about like, well, there's going to be all these Kingsguard men in there, and then we're going to have the Dora Malaysia in there, and then we're going to have the council in there, and where does everybody stand? Well, they stand on top. The women stand on top. And if you notice, the King's Guard is down and sort of out of the way in this circle of life. And you have the women on top, on that top level, with the giant 10-foot mud murals behind them that represent their tribes. Yep. Right, because in that sense, it's the matriarch. So I was always doing their thing, and I'm going to tell you one funny story, and I hope I don't offend anybody. I'm like whispering. So when we, when we went to present all the second phase or third phase round of designs, and I had, just kind of gotten to a place with the palace that I really was like, this is it. I feel like I'm going to show this to Ryan and everybody, and they're going to love it and everything. So I show him this, and I don't know how much you see of it in the movie, and I don't even know if Ryan would be like, why'd you tell the story? But the front door of the palace, he was like, well, what's that look like? And I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, this giant, it was supposed to be like, you see, 80 feet tall, like 8 stories of this for me. He's like, it looks like a, woman part, And I was like, well, I'm a woman. I was like, then maybe we're so used to seeing, all these like very male, tall structures. And I'm like, well, now this is what you got. And I said that to everybody in the room. I was like, yeah, right?
Yeah, that's what it is.
That's what it is. That's my center of power. I gave life, and he's 20, and he's getting me lunch. So, you know what I mean? Like, that's my sense of power. Like, why wouldn't that subconsciously show itself someplace? Just like, all these movies that you look at and designs of cities. Of course, that has to do with what we consider.
Everybody has a new watch list for the weekend.
I am telling you, somebody is going to come after me at Marvel and be like, what are you saying about these things? And I'll be like, well, it was the funniest thing because I never changed it. And every time I see it, I'm just like, oh, there it is. Have a fabulous laugh about it. Yeah.
So we have a little bit of time for some questions. Emphasis on questions. So there are a few people who are going to be walking around with a microphone. Don't try to grab the mic. You will be unsuccessful. But we would love to be able to take some questions for Jacqueline and Hannah from the audience. So the mics are on the sides. Raise your hand. Maybe we can turn the lights up just a little bit, and we can see who's asking. So introduce yourself, your name, your program, and don't give her the mic because she'll keep it forever. Why don't you stand up, Chandra, and ask your question.
Hi again. I'm Chandra, second year urban planning student. And I have a question for both of you. So for Jackie, I wanted to go back to your comment about decolonizing the cinematic imagination, if you could talk more about how your scholarship looks at that. And then for Hannah, I was wondering about, in terms of what you talked about, transforming the Lemonade production set from a place of oppression to a place of empowerment, why you chose to think about that transformation versus just creating a new place as opposed to placing within like the plantation context.
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing I do, thanks for the question, Chandra. One way I guess I try to get at that issue is to look at spectatorship quite a bit, Black spectatorship. As much as I'm interested in what filmmakers do and what's put on the screen, I think that's part of what happens in the exchange. There's so much that happens at the point of reception. There's a loop, actually, right, where meaning is being constructed. So this is one of the reasons why Black Panther is such an important another reason why it's such an important film, you alluded to this, the fact that people were turning out dressed Wakandan. I did an outdoor screening of Black Panther this summer, and we had a costume contest. And I thought it was kind of like, oh, maybe 2 or 3 people. Nah, yeah, everybody. So the ways in which African Americans have figured out how to find pleasure even with films that were not designed to provide any kind of entree for them at all, just to find those small moments or to connect, to be able to appreciate what a maid is doing in a film, right, in a classical Hollywood film, or to somehow make the narrative work for their own purposes, I think is tremendously creative. And that's a really important way that I can see a kind of decolonizing happen, despite what the text might be originating in itself. Yeah.
You're gonna have to tell me your question. I can hear you.
I was wondering in the
Of lemonade.
the place of empowerment versus just creating a whole new landscape for that set.
You know, well, and here's another thing. When the artist is telling you what they want to do, you have to figure out a way to do it, right? And it was really important for her to be on that plantation. So while if it was just like, you know, completely do whatever you want, because there was a lot of leeway she gave me to just do whatever. There was like, okay, she wants to be in these plantations. It was very important for her to take that ownership back, you know, especially in a place like New Orleans is where I'm from, and it probably also speaks to a lot of my work is the way it is. But, you know, so that's why we did it that way, really, necessarily. But yeah, it could have been an entirely new place. I think then it would become something different, because the feeling of what she was trying to convey is not new. How she handles that feeling is new, right? So that's how we learn. That's how we evolve. When we're faced with the same stuff over and over and over and over and over again. It's how we decide to handle it each and every time. If we do the same thing each and every time, then we're probably insane. But if we learn, right, then we can do it a different way. And that's where I think she was actually coming from. What I wanted to do was create a place of sort of free thinking place, because there was a lot, again, we shot a lot that you didn't see because we had done all of this sort of educational side of it, where these women that lived in this plantation were learning to shoot guns, they were learning to, you know, archery, they were doing all these different things, you know, that was their day. And then they all had the duties of in the kitchen, in the, you know, we used a real slave kitchen because this was on Destrehan plantation. We used 2 plantations, but Destrehan was the main one. And so that's you know what some of the things we did. So that was the overall thing. When it was edited, you know, a lot of that was edited out, but I think you still got the feeling of the women in the garden and that. So she's very smart about that, and I mean she knows herself well enough to know that she's had that feeling before. And now this is how she's going to take charge of that and take power of it. And I think that's what that was.
Other questions? Way in the back there? In the gray sweater? Yes, young man right there.
Hi, my name's Lafayette. I'm a second-year Master in City Planning student at MIT. I had a question about the insertion of the humanity of people of color, both in like the histories that you constructed, but then the resulting like futures. I think particularly like with Lemonade and how inserting. I feel like when we talk about plantations, we often ignore the slaves. They're just kind of background people, and the humanity is not there. But you inserted them there. You inserted women of color there, and created this empowered ethno-future. And then in Wakanda, we often think of Africa as this colonized place or this untamed place. But you inserted humanity in history, and so I just wonder how you do that, because in general futurist media, we don't see humanity and people of color in the past or in the future.
I saw something. I was like, well, I do it because I'm black, but and I'm human. So, you know, I put those 2 things together. I'm a smartass. I'm sorry. I'm so silly, and I can't help myself. And maybe that's why Ryan keeps me around, because I keep the laughter coming, but in between all the stress and crying. But yeah, the Lemonade, and you know, having people of color be in the front, or black people, because it was, you know, people of color to me are all people of color, but black people, you know, that sounded weird, but yeah, he's like, okay, but you know, I mean, that was a very important thing. That was part of taking back, right, in a way that felt more useful than some of the language that we use to say we're taking it back. You know what I'm saying? That's why that's in the forefront, you know. And it was a lot about the matriarchy and not the patriarchy. It was a lot about, you know, the generations of women and what we see from generation to generation in Lemonade. In Wakanda, that was a kind of quick answer, but in Wakanda, I mean, again, a fictional African nation, and by where we set it, okay, so it's actually placed above Burundi. We kind of fudged it a little bit and scooched it a little closer to the DRC and added Lake Kivu, like we moved Lake Kivu down a little bit because we wanted it to be on the border of the impenetrable forest. So we did a little bit of changing around in Africa. No big deal, right? No big deal. We just moved some stuff. But after we placed it there, I started looking at all the surrounding countries of who would have then migrated to this one little spot 10,000 years ago. Right? And it's mostly sub-Saharan. When we see Africa, it's either Tarzan or Egypt. And in Egypt, the dark-skinned people are the bad people or the slaves, you know. And if it's Tarzan, you know, it's the help. You know, black people are the help. So again, I think Wakanda is just another form of destroying a narrative, you know, of what, or giving humanity, like Oscar Grant in Fruitvale Station. It was like, I'm going to give him his humanity. Like he is that son and a father. So that's been played out in my work, and it continues to go into my work, is giving people their humanity, because then you can't look away. Then you can't just like walk out of the theater and be like, whatever, you know what I mean? You have to sort of think about it a little more. It's more present, where it's like, oh, okay, you know, these are people as well. I don't know if I answered that very well, but that's what I got.
Yeah. Was there a question over here too?
Yeah.
Right, everybody's grabbing.
Yeah, so my name is Kofi, second year architecture student. I just wanted to say that I'm African. I grew up in Africa. I was born there. And on the issue of depictions, I see a lot of depictions of Africa that, as somebody that is African that grew up in Africa, is totally alien to me. I cannot relate to it. So I just wanted to say that there are fictions out there anyway about Africa that are totally different from the reality of it. I love this fiction. It's something we can have a conversation about, and it's so inspiring. I talk to a lot of friends that still live back home, and they absolutely love it. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, the environment, or, you know, what I noticed in Africa when I went there was, or in South Africa, I was in South Africa, was that there is no camera, there is no thing that has been invented that can replicate what you see with your eyes when you live. So it was like, well, we're not going to try to do that. We're not trying to replicate this vastness and this beauty on camera. We can only, again, capture an essence and a feeling of what I felt when I was there, which was a sense of joy, which was a sense of pride in who your tribe, Xhosa, you know, Xhosa, or Zulu, because that's who, you know, there was a lot of Xhosa people that were our guides. You know, and that were really talking to us about the history, about the Afrikaan history and what that did, about colonization, about apartheid, and what that did to the farmers and all the land grab, right? So, yeah, I was like, I'm never going to be able to fit thousands of languages and thousands of tribes and cultures from this ginormous, I mean, it's like 18 hours to fly across the continent. It's insane. It's huge. That's not a possibility. And had I tried to do that, that would have just been an absolute failure. So what I needed to do was capture all the things that I saw, like, you know, women walking down the street, and they had these great colorful skirts on with these great colorful socks that came all the way up, and these great, you know, the way the babies were being held with a cloth around with their little legs peeping out right here. You know, you just wanted to grab them and kiss them. And the smiles and the joy, like watching the kids when we would go to a township playing soccer, right? And, you know, kicking it over the edge and then having an argument about who was going to get it, you know? And coming up to me and saying, yeah, boo, you know? And all of that. that's the essence I needed to capture when I went to the bride place and, you know, techno music came on. I was like, techno, we're doing this, you know, and watching little kids dance and eating the food. I could only do as much to capture the smell and the texture and the essence of everything that I saw there. I was never going to recreate it, and I was never going to just recreate one thing of it. That's how that went down.
But just really quickly, it just seems like that's a really valuable aspect of what you're doing. It's not about all fiction being bad, nor is it that your research has to be so exhaustive that you get every particular detail right and include it all. And it just seems like there's some lessons there in terms of thinking about the implications for something like design, right? Like if you think of Wakanda more as a kind of like design fiction, where you get to play out some different possibilities rather than something that's accurately documenting or trying to be true to a variety of disciplines or something like that, then that honors the creative work that you're doing, and that can also animate all of the work that we try to do.
And you know, it speaks a little to gentrification, because it's like, why can't we go to, so you know, there's like, everybody's talking about the mashup, right? And I was talking about the migration. So are they just supposed to give up the way they know to build, the way they know to create and craft, because they've all of a sudden now there's like two other tribes around them? It's like, oh, well, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to create something completely new out of it. No, I think part of that is allowing there to be a space for you in your culture and your tradition.
And how does the creation of that space evolve as other migrants and other histories sort of usurp it? And just as an essence informs your work, you know, a set of values informs your work. And so I think the translation for us as designers is, you know, what are the values we think we're bringing to design, and not just a technocratic approach to that? And then how does that then translate and respond to a context? So we have one last question from a student. I'd like that to be the last question for the night.
Thank you.
So stand up, tell us who you are.
Okay. Hello, my name is Ashley. I'm a second year at the Divinity School here. And so I actually am in a class with Professor Olapona about African religions. And you mentioned spirituality. And we were in a discussion about how that plays in the film. So I was wondering how indigenous African religions actually are present in set design and in your, you know, concept of designing the film, if that played a role at all.
You know, it does in a sense. So again, it's a lot of stuff that's not seen. Had we done it all, you know, we filmed a lot. There was hours of film, right? And the first cut of Black Panther was close to 5 hours. Because we went, you know, everything's got to go in. I was happy with it. It looked fabulous. But it's like, who's sitting for 5 hours? You know what I mean? Like, it's fun, but calm down, right? It's like level up, pull up. So we did there was a lot of that spirituality was surrounded in the City of the Dead, you know, and it really got cut down a little bit. So that was, you know, it's still great, and it's a lot of Ryan's sensibility about how he is a director, because he's in and out of scenes pretty quickly. You'll notice the pacing of his films are really quick. And he doesn't, you know, spend, I think more than anything in Wakanda, he spent a little bit more time on sort of the settings and stuff, but it's really what people, it's their environments and canvas. So that part of it, you know, there was this whole idea of, how the vibranium was discovered in the first place. And we really went towards a religious and spiritual way that was discovered by the monks. So, you know, that was really inspired to me by Samsara. I don't know if anybody's seen that film, but Samsara is fabulous. And that was what that inspiration was, but it was a whole thing about how they discovered this, and using sort of, even in some Asian traditions, of sort of low vocals in African traditions. So since vibranium is sensitive to energy, sound, light, anything, when our Wakandan monks started in a meditation of low vocalization, they noticed that the vibranium was becoming brighter. Yeah. And it was heating up. Then they realized that when they were, in a lot of African tribes bury, but in Wakanda they do both. They bury and burn the dead. So that's one way that they would bury their dead, is to lay out the vibranium rocks. They didn't know what it was, and then they would all gather around in a circle, and they would do a low vocalization that would then heat up the rocks and burn the body. That's how they found fire in Wakanda tens of thousands of years before any Western nation, right? That's part of their advancement. So through that spirituality and through that religion, they advanced themselves. Unfortunately, that didn't end up on the screen, but maybe in Black Panther too. Ba-da-ba. See you tomorrow.
And on that note,